Adolf Galland's story reveals how brilliance and bravery in the skies couldn't save the Luftwaffe from disastrous leadership decisions, where momentary victories came at devastating costs, and one ignored warning sealed the fate of Germany's air war. At 10:15 a.m. on August 17, 1943, General Adolf Galland stood on a station platform at Rinton Heath in East Prussia, watching Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring climb aboard his opulent train. They had just concluded a meeting about Luftwaffe fighter operations. Galland had urgent intelligence to hand over before Göring departed. American fighters were appearing far inside German airspace. Earlier that same morning, Luftwaffe fighters had intercepted a large American bomber attack aimed at Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The clash followed the familiar pattern. German fighters waited near the border, while the American escorts, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back when fuel ran low, leaving the bombers unprotected as they pressed on into Germany. Luftwaffe units struck the unescorted bombers. Then something unprecedented occurred. A fresh wave of American fighters showed up, not Thunderbolts but different planes, engaging German fighters more than 150 miles inside Germany, well beyond any expected escort range. Galland compiled reports from squadron leaders across the Reich and concluded the intruders were Lockheed P-38 Lightnings fitted with external drop tanks. Those tanks greatly extended their range and changed the tactical picture. Galland approached Göring on the platform and laid out his findings. Long-range American fighters, using drop tanks, were escorting bombers deep into Germany, engaging over Schweinfurt, Regensburg and other targets that should have been out of reach. The old tactic of waiting for escorts to turn for home was no longer defensible. Göring listened, expression stony, voice rising. He refused to accept the reports. In his view, the accounts were mistaken. The aircraft Galland described must have been crippled fighters gliding east after being hit over France or Belgium. Rare anomalies, not proof of extended escort capability. Galland pushed back, describing the drop tanks, and pointing out that multiple squadrons had reported identical encounters the same day. These were fully operational fighters, not damaged planes drifting home. Göring cut him off, insisting it was physically impossible for American fighters to penetrate so far inland, and he issued an order declaring that no such escorts had reached central Germany. Galland understood what the order meant. Göring was denying inconvenient intelligence. The Reichsmarschall would not accept information that contradicted his assumptions. Galland answered with what witnesses later remembered as a memorable smile. "Orders are orders, sir." The train left. Galland watched it go, aware that the Luftwaffe had just lost a chance to ready itself for a threat it had been ordered to ignore. What followed would cost thousands of German pilots their lives fighting an enemy their leaders pretended did not exist. Losses mounted almost immediately after Göring dismissed Galland's warning. On August 17, 1943, the day of the confrontation at the station, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 25 to 27 fighters during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids. Many fell to the long-range P-38 escorts Göring insisted could not reach the targets. That twin mission to Schweinfurt and Regensburg proved Galland right. American formations penetrated deep into Germany with continuous fighter protection far beyond previously seen ranges. German fighters that attacked the bomber streams were met by P-38 escorts appearing from high altitude, at distances nobody had expected. The fighting was savage. Although the Americans lost about 60 bombers that day, German fighter losses and aircrew casualties were severe. The mission marked a turning point. For the first time, the Luftwaffe faced American bomber formations, escorted throughout their entire penetration of German airspace. The assumption that escorts would peel off at predictable points was shattered. German commanders had to accept that American escorts could materialize anywhere, deep inside Germany at any moment. 3 weeks later, on September 6, 1943, another disastrous encounter confirmed Galland's warnings. A formation of B-17s attacked Stuttgart, with P-38 escorts reaching deep into southern Germany. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II led the interception. Meyer, one of Germany's most effective bomber killers with 57 victories, had refined head-on attacks against American heavies to reduce exposure to defensive fire. His squadron struck from ahead as planned and scored hits, but P-38 escorts dove in from altitude, having waited above and behind the stream for just this moment. Mayer's formation was broken up. 3 German fighters were shot down in the initial pass. Mayer himself barely escaped when a P-38 locked onto his tail. He pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a steep dive and managed to outrun the heavier American fighter. But 5 of his pilots did not return. 3 killed, 2 taken prisoner after bailing out. No bombers were confirmed destroyed. The mission was a complete failure. By October 1943, the pattern was undeniable. American bombers were striking deep into Germany with escorts Göring had declared impossible. The Luftwaffe persisted in fighting with tactics built on disproven assumptions. Pilots were told escorts could not reach certain targets and planned attacks accordingly. Then escorts appeared and shot them down. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, another Schweinfurt raid produced catastrophic losses on both sides. Roughly 60 American bombers lost. And the Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters, with many pilots killed or wounded. On December 4, 1943, Helmut Lent of Jagdgeschwader 3 was killed near Dordrecht in the Netherlands. Lent, credited with 131 victories and one of Germany's most successful aces, was shot down in combat with P-47 Thunderbolts from the 352nd Fighter Group. He was 23. The deaths of seasoned aces like Lent were an irreplaceable blow to Luftwaffe effectiveness. The Black Thursday raid showed both the strengths and limits of American strategy. Losing 60 bombers in one day, about 9% of the attacking force, with some 600 airmen killed or captured, was unsustainable unless escorts could accompany the bombers to the target and back. The 8th Air Force temporarily halted deep penetration raids for several weeks after Black Thursday to rebuild strength and await more long-range escorts. For the Luftwaffe, however, the raid was ominous in another way. Despite destroying 60 bombers, German losses were approaching parity. Previously, the exchange rate had favored the defenders by 3 or 4 bombers destroyed for every fighter lost. Now the ratio was nearing 1-to-1. At that pace, the Luftwaffe risked being ground down by attrition long before Allied bomber strength was seriously dented. Galland recognized the arithmetic. In November 1943, he produced a detailed report analyzing monthly fighter losses from June through October. June 87 fighters, July 106, August 174, September 193, October 224. The trend was clear, losses were accelerating. Even worse, the balance of experience in the cockpit was reversing. In June, 60% of fighter pilots had more than 6 months combat experience. By October, that figure had dropped to 40%. The Luftwaffe was losing its most valuable resource, veteran pilots who could survive combat and train replacements. Galland warned that without immediate action, the fighter force would hit a critical breaking point within 6 months, after which losses would outpace the training pipeline and the force would enter an unrecoverable downward spiral. He sent the report to Göring, the Air Ministry, and anyone in the chain of command who would look. The answer was silence. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Air Ministry issued directives urging higher morale and more aggressive tactics, but nobody addressed the core problem. German pilots were increasingly outnumbered, outproduced and outmatched by better-trained Allied aircrews, flying longer-ranged fighters. Galland logged each loss, compiled reports, and sent weekly summaries to Göring and the High Command, outlining the tactical situation in detail and arguing that American long-range escorts were accompanying bombers throughout German airspace. The old doctrine of waiting for escorts to turn back had become obsolete. Immediate changes were needed. New tactics, increased fighter production, expanded pilot training, and rushing the Me-262 jet into service despite development issues, because its speed might allow penetration of escort screens to strike bombers. Göring did not respond. He had decided in August that long-range American fighters were not a strategic threat, and the Luftwaffe would continue as before. Nothing changed. But the situation only worsened through November and December 1943 as American fighter capability grew beyond even Galland's warnings. Then on December 1, 1943, a new development appeared over Germany that made the P-38 threat seem almost tame by comparison. The North American P-51 Mustang entered combat. The P-51 had been in service for about 2 years in several roles. Early models flew low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack missions for the Royal Air Force, and the U.S. Army Air Forces used them in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Those initial Mustangs were fitted with Allison engines that lost power at high altitude, so they could not accompany heavy bombers where the air war over Germany was fought. German intelligence assessed these early Mustangs as no threat to high-altitude bomber operations. Then North American fitted the Mustang airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, whose two-stage supercharger sustained power above 30,000 feet. The Mustang's clean aerodynamics combined with the Merlin's high-altitude performance produced a remarkable fighter, able to reach the same altitudes as German fighters, often faster at height, able to dogfight with them, and possessing roughly twice the range of previous escorts. With 2 external drop tanks, a P-51 could fly more than 800 miles from base, loiter over a target in combat, and return. Berlin lay roughly 600 miles from England, so every German industrial target suddenly became reachable by escorted daylight raids. On December 1, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew the first P-51B combat sortie over Europe from Leiston, Boxford Airfield in England. The group had only recently received its Mustangs after training on P-39 Airacobras in the United States. Many pilots had fewer than 5 hours in the P-51 before their first mission, but the airplane was easy to handle and forgiving. It responded crisply, accelerated quickly, and could sustain high-speed maneuvers without bleeding energy. Pilots who had flown P-47s said the Mustang handled like a fighter half its weight. On December 5th, P-51s escorted bombers to Amiens in northern France. On December 11th, they reached Methven on the German coast. Then, on December 13, 1943, they achieved a decisive breakthrough. 55 P-51s escorted B-17s to Kiel, about 480 miles from England and roughly 240 miles inside Germany. The sortie lasted 4 hours and 30 minutes. The Mustangs fought Luftwaffe interceptors over the target and shot down 6 German fighters without loss. American heavies struck shipyard facilities with little interference. The mission demonstrated that U.S. heavy bombers could now reach any target in Germany with fighter protection. The escort problem that had plagued strategic bombing since 1942 was effectively solved. Galland recognized the danger at once. He went to Berlin in late December 1943 to brief Göring, bringing technical data, performance figures, and combat reports from pilots who had encountered the new fighter. The P-51 outpaced the Bf-109 and Fw-190 at most altitudes, could turn with German fighters, and had longer range than any previous escort. With drop tanks, it could reach any point in Germany. Galland urged emergency steps, concentrate all available resources on fighter production, prioritize the Me-262 jet program, and accelerate training despite fuel shortages. Germany had to adapt immediately or risk strategic defeat in the air. Göring waved the warnings away, dismissing the Mustang as just another American fighter and insisting German pilots and tactics would prevail. Galland pressed the intelligence and warned what would happen if P-51s escorted raids to Berlin. Göring refused to listen. Galland left convinced the Luftwaffe had sealed its fate. Through January and February 1944, the strategic bombing campaign intensified and more P-51s appeared, escorting raids to Frankfurt, Leipzig, and other central German targets. Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. On February 20, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Argument Big Week, 6 days of concentrated attacks on German aircraft factories intended to destroy production capacity and force Luftwaffe fighters into decisive combat. Over 3,500 American bombers struck targets across Germany, escorted by swarms of P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the raids. Veteran aces flew multiple sorties daily, and rookies with minimal training were pushed into battle. Casualties were devastating. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost some 262 fighters destroyed, and another 180 so badly damaged they were out of action. Pilot losses were grim as well. Roughly 100 killed, 90 wounded, and 43 missing, including squadron leaders and experienced veterans who could not be replaced. Major Egon Meyer, who had survived the September disaster, was killed on March 2, 1944, when P-47 escorts shot him down over France. He had 102 victories and was 29. Helmut Kurt Wieberl, or other leading aces, fell on February 22 during an interception over Brunswick. He had more than 100 kills and was in his mid-20s. These were not green pilots, but the core of Germany's combat expertise, the men who trained recruits, devised tactics, and survived multiple engagements. They were dying faster than they could be replaced. Galland watched casualty lists with mounting despair. Her minimally competent fighter pilot required about 6 months training, a year to be good and 2 years to be excellent. Germany was losing pilots with 2, 3, or 4 years of experience and replacing them with flyers who had only 3 months of instruction. Some arrived at frontline units with fewer than 200 flight hours, compared with Allied pilots who often brought 400, 500 hours to combat. The skill gap was enormous, and the outcome predictable. New German pilots averaged only 5 combat missions before being killed or wounded. The Luftwaffe was being destroyed not merely by aircraft losses, but by the systematic elimination of its experienced pilot corps. The training crisis had many causes. Germany had not planned for a long war of attrition. The 1939 training system was designed to produce replacements for a force expected to win quickly through tactical superiority. It assumed veteran pilots would survive to mentor newcomers, that fuel for training would be available, and that training airfields would remain secure. By 1944, none of those assumptions held. Veteran pilots were being lost faster than they could train others. Fuel allocations to schools were cut to feed frontline needs. Allied strikes destroyed training fields, aircraft, and instructors. The pipeline that had yielded excellent pilots in 1940 collapsed into a machine that churned out barely competent flyers who were sent to their deaths. Galland tried to fix the system. He requested more fuel for training units, urged pulling experienced pilots from frontline duty to serve as instructors, and proposed shortening operational tours so veterans could survive to teach. Every request was denied. Göring demanded that all resources go to the front, insisting fighters were needed in combat, not in schools. That calculation may have seemed logical short-term, but was strategically fatal. By refusing to invest in training, Germany guaranteed a continuous decline in pilot quality until the force, no matter how many aircraft it produced, would cease to function effectively. The Americans understood and exploited this dynamic. In early 1944, General James Doolittle, who took command of the 8th Air Force in January, revised escort doctrine. Where fighters had once been ordered to remain close to bomber boxes, Doolittle freed them to pursue German aircraft aggressively. Fighter groups were sent ahead of bomber streams to seek Luftwaffe units while they were forming, and Mustang groups strafed German airfields to destroy planes on the ground. The aim was not merely bomber protection, but the wholesale destruction of the Luftwaffe by killing pilots and wrecking aircraft wherever possible. The new doctrine proved devastatingly effective. German pilots now faced American fighters during every phase of a mission. During climb-out, they could be attacked. While forming up, they could be ambushed by roving Mustangs. Over the bombers, they had to fight through escort screens, and on the return leg, they could be pursued with low fuel and shot down. No phase was safe. American fighters had the numbers, performance, and pilot quality to dominate. On March 4, 1944, the strategic situation passed a point of no return when American bombers struck Berlin with full fighter escort for the first time. Over 600 heavy bombers attacked the capital, accompanied by 174 P-51s that completed the entire 100-mile round trip. The Mustangs fought and beat Luftwaffe defenders over the heart of the Reich, downing 16 German fighters, while losing only 4 of their own. The sight of Mustangs over Berlin reportedly convinced Göring privately that the war was lost, though he continued publicly to assert control and optimism. By April 1944, Galland was so alarmed he bypassed Göring and filed a report straight to the High Command, dated April 27, 1944, detailing the collapse of the Luftwaffe fighter force. In the previous 10 major operations, the Luftwaffe had lost roughly 500 aircraft and 400 pilots. From January through April, more than 1,000 pilots had been killed, wounded, or captured. In some battles, Allied fighters outnumbered German ones 6-1 or 8-1. Allied pilot training was far superior. Most US and British pilots entering combat had 400 to 500 hours, while many German pilots went into battle with under 200 hours, some less than 150. Training infrastructure had been crippled by fuel shortages and constant attacks on airfields. Galland wrote that he would have preferred the Me-262 in service immediately, rather than 5 additional Bf-109s. The Me-262, which he had long advocated as an interceptor, was about 100 mph faster than any Allied fighter, and could have flown through escort screens to attack bombers. Hitler, however, had ordered the jet developed as a bomber, wasting months converting it for that role, before finally allowing fighter use too late in 1944 to change the course of the air war. Losses continued through spring and summer 1944. Between January and May, some 2,262 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing, with March especially devastating. Entire squadrons were shattered. Elite units lost dozens of pilots in weeks. The numerical and industrial imbalance was stark. Germany might take months to replace 10 fighters, while the US could replace 100 in days. Britain could replace lost bombers in a week. The pilot training pipeline could not match Allied capacity. The strategic situation was unequal, and Germany was losing an attritional war it could not win. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. The Luftwaffe had been expected to contest the landings with fighter and bomber strikes, but its strength in France was inadequate. Luftflotte 3 had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed roughly 319 sorties against 14,674 Allied sorties. The disparity was so great, many Allied troops did not see a single German plane in the first week. German pilots who attempted attacks faced withering flak and swarms of Allied fighters. Few survived. The Normandy campaign marked the final collapse of Luftwaffe effectiveness in the West. Oberleutnant Josef Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26 and one of Germany's most successful leaders with 101 victories, including many Spitfires, was among the few who struck the invasion fleet. On D-Day morning, Priller and his wingman were the only German pilots to attack the beaches directly, flying FW-190s at very low altitude from bases in the Low Countries to avoid detection. They strafed Sword Beach and returned. Priller called the mission suicidal, but necessary to show the Luftwaffe had not entirely abandoned the army. He survived the war and died in 1961. In the weeks after D-Day, Luftwaffe units launched desperate but futile efforts to support ground forces against overwhelming Allied air power. Losses mounted. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West. July losses exceeded 400, and August approached 500. German aircraft production actually rose, with factories producing over 1,500 fighters per month by mid-1944. But production could not compensate for the lack of trained pilots, fuel shortages, spare parts, and bombed maintenance facilities. New aircraft rarely survived many missions. By July, Galland was receiving casualty reports, showing some 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day, while training schools graduated only about 30 pilots weekly. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. The force could not sustain those losses. Commanders reported that new pilots arriving from training were essentially useless in combat. They could not keep formation. They panicked under fire, and they made fatal errors that killed themselves and their comrades. One veteran squadron leader likened receiving freshly trained pilots in mid-1944 to executing them. There were no reserves. Every graduate went immediately to the front and typically died within weeks. Galland pushed for Me-262 production, improved training programs despite fuel constraints, and new tactics for engaging heavily escorted bomber streams. He even flew unauthorized missions himself to learn what his men faced and to trial tactics. None of it stopped the fundamental problem. Overwhelming Allied numbers, superior training, robust logistics, and limitless industrial capacity meant German tactical innovation alone could not reverse the collapse. Some leaders adapted. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77 for much of 1944 and would ultimately score many victories, recognized the old methods were obsolete and developed aggressive tactics. His units would not wait for escorts to peel off, but would strike immediately, engaging escorts first in an effort to clear the bombers. Early Mustangs had Allison engines and poor high-altitude performance, but when fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin and external drop tanks, the P-51 gained the speed, maneuverability, and range to escort heavy bombers deep into Germany. Entering combat in December 1943, Mustangs soon proved decisive. On December 13th, 50-plus P-51s escorted B-17s to Kiel and back, shooting down interceptors and showing that escorted daylight raids could reach any German industrial target. Adolf Galland warned Göring, urging emergency increases in fighter production, accelerated training and prioritizing the Me-262 as an interceptor, but his appeals were ignored. In early 1944, Mustang numbers grew and doctrine changed under General Doolittle. Fighters were freed to seek and destroy Luftwaffe units and to strafe airfields, culminating in Big Week, 20 February, which shattered German production and cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. On 4th of March 1944, P-51s escorted a raid on Berlin, confirming American air superiority. Galland's April 27th report warned the fighter force was collapsing as losses outpaced training and replacements. Germany's late jet program and rising aircraft production could not overcome fuel shortages, bombed maintenance, and a ruined training pipeline. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the invasion, and desperate, costly sorties afterward only accelerated the destruction of Germany's experienced pilot corps. It was a dangerous gamble that brought results, but at terrible cost. Steinhoff's methods increased his unit's shoot-down tally, yet their own casualties rose as well. For roughly every 2 enemy planes they destroyed, Jagdgeschwader 77 lost nearly 2 fighters. At that rate, no formation could remain effective for long. Germany's best pilots and its most inventive leaders were being killed, and years of practical knowledge vanished faster than it could be passed on. Galland felt that futility himself during an unauthorized sortie in spring 1944. Flying an FW-190 over Magdeburg to see firsthand what his men faced, he encountered a vast bomber stream guarded by some 50 escorts, mostly P-51 Mustangs, flying loose patrols above and alongside the heavies. He rolled in on a bomber at the formation's edge, but had scarcely begun to set up, when tracers whipped past his canopy and 4 Mustangs dove on him. He broke hard and plunged away while they followed. Using an old trick, he fired his guns to leave smoke trails that made it look as if his tail guns were firing. The Mustangs peeled off into a climbing turn, and Galland slipped away at high speed. He landed back without ever attacking the bombers. He had been in position for fewer than 5 seconds before the escorts engaged, and understood why his pilots were failing. The American escorts were ubiquitous, aggressive, highly skilled, and numerically overwhelming. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm existed more on paper than in reality. Organizational charts listed squadrons. Factories produced aircraft. Pilots were assigned, but there was no coherent force able to defend German skies. Fuel shortages kept units grounded for days. Inexperienced trainees crashed during abbreviated instruction, and planes sat idle for lack of spare parts. When missions did go up, Allied numbers and skills simply overwhelmed them. On 2 November 1944, Galland sent 500 fighters against 975 American bombers attacking oil plants. With some 800 escorting fighters, roughly 600 were P-51s. The Americans shot down 98 German fighters and killed 78 pilots. American losses totaled only 50 aircraft, 30 of which fell to flak. Germany could not sustain losses like that. Furious at the situation and planning the Ardennes offensive, Hitler ordered Galland to ready his fighter reserves for ground support rather than homeland defense. Veteran hard-fighting wings were diverted to bolster an offensive doomed from the start. Galland realized any hope of the massed fighter counterattacks he had planned was gone. In January 1945, he was removed as General der Jagdflieger on 13th January. Göring blamed him for the Luftwaffe's failures, the repeated complaints, and his criticism of the High Command. After the so-called fighter pilots' revolt, when several senior commanders confronted Göring, Galland was accused of fomenting dissent. He was placed under house arrest at a hunting lodge and faced possible court-martial and worse. The SS and Gestapo opened files on him, and Himmler pushed for treason charges. Hitler, however, vetoed harsh punishment. He valued Galland's fame and feared the propaganda fallout of prosecuting Germany's most famous ace. Hitler allowed Galland to return to duty on one condition. He would form and lead Jagdverband 44, an elite jet unit equipped with the Me-262 and manned by the best surviving pilots. Galland accepted and recruited a cadre of Knight's Cross holders, experienced diocese including Johannes Steinhoff and other top scorers, who began receiving Me-262s. In late February and March 1945, the jet lived up to Galland's claims, capable of about 540 MAPs, roughly 100 MUPI faster than any Allied fighter, armed with 4 30mm cannons and able to reach 30,000 feet in minutes. Its acceleration and top speed let it pick engagements and disengage at will. Allied piston fighters could not catch it in level flight or in a dive. The jets were vulnerable mainly during takeoff and landing, so Allied pilots patrolled near known bases to ambush them low and slow, producing fierce fights around German jet airfields as conventional fighters tried to shield the jets. Galland flew his first Me-262 combat sortie on 31 March 1945 from Munich-Rhein airfield, intercepting a formation near Neuburg and claiming a B-26 Marauder with a brief burst from his 30mm guns that tore the medium bomber apart. Over the next month, he added several more heavy bombers to his score. Jagdverband 44 accounted for dozens of Allied aircraft in March-April 1945. Despite tactical successes, the strategic picture was irretrievable. Soviet forces battled in Berlin's streets. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and swept through western Germany. Cities lay in ruins from sustained bombing, and aviation fuel production had collapsed after attacks on synthetic fuel plants. Even elite jet units were frequently grounded for lack of fuel. Jagdverband 44 flew its last combat mission on 26 April 1945. Around 1500 hours that day, Galland's Me-262 was hit by a P-47 Thunderbolt flown by First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 56th Fighter Group, while Galland was engaging bombers south of Munich. 50 caliber rounds shredded his canopy and instrument panel, struck both engines, and sent metal fragments into his right knee. The damaged jet was barely controllable. Galland nursed it back and crash-landed near the airfield. X-rays later revealed 2 metal splinters lodged in his kneecap. The wounds ended his flying and he was removed from command. Johannes Steinhoff succeeded him. 8 days later, on 8 May 1945, Germany surrendered. Galland's final combat record stood at 104 victories against Western Allied aircraft over some 705 missions in 6 years. He had been shot down 4 times and survived each. He had led the Luftwaffe's fighter arm during its most perilous phase and had striven to repair a system that was beyond repair, not through lack of effort or skill, but because the strategic realities and leadership choices made recovery impossible. In 1979, Galland met James Finnegan at an Air Force Association event in San Francisco after a researcher matched combat reports. The 2 aviators talked for hours about the engagement and their wartime experiences, showing mutual professional respect between men who had fought on opposite sides in a terrible conflict. Adolf Galland survived the war. He was taken prisoner by Allied forces and held until 1947, after which he spent 6 years as a military advisor to the Argentine Air Arm, before returning to Germany in 1955 to work as an aerospace consultant. His memoir, published in 1954, recounted his years as General der Jagdflieger and his clashes with Göring and Hitler over air strategy, and became a key primary source on Luftwaffe operations. Galland lived until 1996, dying at 83. Asked later when he first realized Germany would lose the air war, he pointed to August 1943. That was when he warned Göring about long-range American fighters and was ordered to stop reporting the threat. He argued afterward that Göring's refusal to accept the evidence and to act then cost Germany any realistic chance of holding air superiority. Had the Luftwaffe adapted when drop tank P-38s first appeared, or shifted resources to jets and training earlier, the conflict in the air might have been prolonged and Allied losses increased, even if ultimate defeat remained likely. Historians later found extensive documentation of Galland's platform confrontation with Göring, his intelligence on long-range escorts, and Göring's dismissive order. Combat records and pilot testimony confirmed that escorts were penetrating deep into Germany, just as Galland had warned. Rather than praise or formal acknowledgement, official records mostly attribute the Luftwaffe's collapse to Allied numerical and industrial superiority. Galland's reports and suggested remedies, sent months before the crisis peaked, were ignored. The practical result was catastrophic. Thousands of pilots killed, veteran leaders gone, the training system shattered, fuel and production crippled, and German airspace lost. Military analysts view Göring's rejection of Galland's August 1943 warnings as one of the war's gravest command failures, an example of how catastrophe can follow when commanders refuse uncomfortable intelligence, punish truth-tellers, and issue orders that deny reality. Galland tried to warn, provided remedies, was rebuffed, and watched as countless German airmen died fighting a threat their leaders had ordered them to pretend did not exist.